Jack had always been a free spirit, hitchhiking across the country, living off the kindness of strangers. One rainy night, he was picked up by an old, beat-up truck driven by a middle-aged man with piercing blue eyes. The man introduced himself as Tom but offered little else in the way of conversation as they drove through the dark, winding roads of the countryside. Jack noticed the silence between them growing increasingly uncomfortable. Tom would occasionally glance at Jack with those unsettling blue eyes, making Jack's skin crawl. When they finally reached a small, decrepit gas station, Tom abruptly pulled over and told Jack he needed to use the restroom. Jack waited in the truck, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over him. After what felt like an eternity, he decided to go inside and check on Tom. As he approached the restroom door, he heard muffled voices coming from inside. Pressing his ear to the door, he realized it wasn't Tom talking. It was multiple voices, whispering urgently. Before he could react, the door swung open, and Tom stepped out, his face pale and eyes wild. Without a word, he grabbed Jack by the arm and dragged him back to the truck. They drove off in silence, the tension between them thicker than ever. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened in that restroom, something he was now a part of. Jack's heart pounded as they sped through the night, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil inside the truck. Tom's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. The whispers from the gas station restroom echoed in Jack's mind, chilling him to the core. Finally, Tom broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come in," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. Jack wanted to ask what he meant, but the fear in Tom's voice kept him silent. They drove for what felt like hours, the rain never letting up. Jack noticed they were heading deeper into the woods, away from any sign of civilization. Anxiety gnawed at him, but he couldn't bring himself to ask where they were going. The truck's headlights barely pierced the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the trees that seemed to close in on them. Suddenly, Tom veered off the road onto a narrow, overgrown path. The truck bounced and jostled over the uneven ground, branches scraping against the windows. They finally came to a stop in a small clearing. Tom turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment before turning to Jack. "You need to know something," Tom said, his voice trembling. "What you heard back there, it wasn't just voices. It's something that follows me, something I can't escape. And now it's latched onto you too." Jack's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice shaking. Tom sighed, rubbing his temples. "I picked up a hitchhiker a few months ago. He was different, told me things I didn't want to hear, things about my past, my future. Then he just disappeared. Since then, I've been hearing voices, seeing things. It's like he's still here, haunting me. And now he's haunting you too." Jack's mind raced. Could this be true? Or was Tom just crazy? Before he could decide, the truck's windows fogged up, and the temperature dropped suddenly. Jack felt a presence in the truck, something cold and malevolent. "Get out," Tom whispered urgently. "Get out and run. Don't look back." Jack didn't need to be told twice. He threw open the door and bolted into the woods, the rain drenching him instantly. He ran blindly, branches slashing at his face and arms. Behind him, he heard Tom's voice, now mixed with those same urgent whispers, growing louder and more frantic. Jack kept running, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to get away from that truck, from Tom, and from whatever horror was now following him. The darkness seemed to press in on him from all sides, the rain soaking him to the bone that he stumbled over roots and rocks, falling several times but always getting back up. The whispers grew fainter, but they were still there, a constant reminder of the terror that now pursued him. Jack had no idea how long he ran, but eventually, he saw the faint glow of a light through the trees. Hope surged within him as he stumbled toward the light. He emerged from the woods onto a narrow dirt road, where an old farmhouse stood, its windows glowing warmly. He banged on the door, desperate for help. An elderly couple answered. their faces filled with concern as they took in Jack's disheveled appearance. He tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and frantic. They ushered him inside, offering him a towel and a seat by the fire as Jack sat there, trying to calm his racing heart. He realized he had escaped Tom and the whispers for now, but deep down he knew this was far from over. The darkness that had attached itself to Tom was now part of his life, and it wouldn't rest until it had consumed him entirely. Jack sat by the fire, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill that had settled in his bones. The elderly couple, Martha and George, listened intently as he recounted his harrowing experience. Their kind faces grew somber as he described the strange voices and Tom's eerie warning. After he finished, Martha exchanged a worried glance with George. "We've heard stories like this before," she said quietly. "People picking up hitchhikers and then things following them." George nodded, his face grim. "There's an old legend around these parts about a spirit that preys on travelers. It attaches itself to those who are kind enough to help strangers, feeding on their fears and driving them mad." Jack shuddered. "What can I do? How do I get rid of it?" Martha placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "There might be a way. There's a woman who lives deep in the woods, not far from here. People say she has gifts. She might be able to help you." Despite his exhaustion, Jack felt a flicker of hope. "Can you take me to her?" George shook his head. "It's too dangerous at night. You'll stay here and rest. At first light, I'll take you to her." That night, Jack barely slept, the whispers from the gas station haunting his dreams. He woke with the dawn, feeling more determined than ever to rid himself of this malevolent force. After a quick breakfast, George led Jack through the woods. They walked in silence, the forest eerily quiet around them. Eventually, they arrived at a small, weathered cabin, smoke curling from its chimney. An elderly woman with sharp, piercing eyes opened the door before they could knock. "I've been expecting you," she said, her voice both soothing and unsettling. Inside, the cabin was filled with strange herbs and talismans. The woman, who introduced herself as Eliza, motioned for Jack to sit. She studied him intently before speaking. "The spirit that follows you is ancient and powerful. It feeds on fear and despair, growing stronger with each victim. But there is a way to banish it." Jack leaned forward, desperate. "Tell me what to do." Eliza began to prepare a mixture of herbs, chanting softly under her breath. "You must confront the spirit, face your fear, and break its hold on you. This potion will help you see it, but the rest is up to you." She handed Jack a small vial of a dark, viscous liquid. "Drink this tonight, when the moon is high. The spirit will reveal itself, and you must fight it with every ounce of your strength." As night fell, Jack returned to the farmhouse, clutching the vial tightly. Martha and George offered him words of encouragement, but he could see the worry in their eyes. When the moon reached its peak, Jack drank the potion, the bitter taste making him gag. Almost immediately, the room began to warp and shift. Shadows lengthened, and the air grew cold. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. Jack's heart pounded as a figure emerged from the darkness. A twisted, spectral form with hollow eyes and a malevolent grin. "Why do you resist?" the spirit hissed, its voice echoing in Jack's mind. "You cannot escape me." Jack took a deep breath, summoning his courage. "I won't let you control me," he said, his voice firm despite his fear. "You're nothing but a parasite, feeding on fear. I refuse to be your victim." The spirit shrieked in rage, its form flickering as if struggling to maintain its shape. Jack focused on the warmth of the fire, the kindness of Martha and George, and the determination that had brought him this far. He imagined a barrier of light around him, pushing back the darkness. The spirit's screams grew louder, but Jack held his ground, refusing to give in. Slowly, the whispers began to fade, the cold receding. The spirit's form disintegrated, dissolving into the night. When it was over, Jack collapsed, exhausted but triumphant. Martha and George rushed to his side, their faces filled with relief. "You did it," Martha said, tears of joy in her eyes. You broke its hold. Jack nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The darkness that had haunted him was gone, and he knew he had his life back. Though the experience had changed him, he was stronger for it. As he looked at the kind faces of Martha and George, he knew he would never forget their help and the courage he had found within himself. With a grateful heart, Jack set out the next morning, determined to continue his journey with a newfound sense of freedom and purpose, forever wary of the shadows that lingered just beyond the light. Martha had always been wary of picking up hitchhikers, but when she saw the young woman standing on the side of the road, drenched from the rain and looking utterly desperate, she couldn't help herself. She pulled over and offered the girl a ride. The girl, who introduced herself as Emily, was quiet but polite, thanking Martha repeatedly for her kindness as they drove through the night. Martha tried to make small talk, but Emily's responses were curt and distant. After a while, Martha noticed that Emily's clothes, though soaked, seemed strangely outdated, like they belonged to another era. Trying to brush off her unease, Martha focused on the road ahead. Suddenly, Emily began to cry, her sobs racking her small frame. Martha pulled over, trying to comfort her, but Emily wouldn't stop crying. She kept repeating something under her breath, something Martha couldn't quite make out. When Martha finally managed to calm her down, Emily looked at her with hollow, haunted eyes and whispered, "They never found me." Before Martha could ask what she meant, Emily vanished. One moment she was there, and the next, the passenger seat was empty, the only evidence of her presence being the damp spot on the seat. Terrified, Martha drove to the nearest police station and recounted her story. The officer on duty listened intently before pulling out an old newspaper clipping. It was a story about a young woman named Emily who had gone missing years ago while hitchhiking on that very road. Martha couldn't shake the unsettling encounter with Emily, the vanishing hitchhiker. Days turned into weeks, but the image of the drenched girl and her haunting words lingered in Martha's mind. Determined to find out more about Emily, Martha returned to the police station, hoping to uncover any additional details about the young woman's disappearance. The officer she spoke with, Officer Ramirez, was sympathetic to her curiosity. "Emily's case is one of the strangest I've ever seen," he said, pulling out a thick file. "She disappeared almost 20 years ago, and there have been numerous sightings of her ever since. Always on that same stretch of road, always during a storm." Martha shivered. "Do you have any idea what happened to her?" Ramirez shook his head. "We suspect foul play, but we've never found her body. It's like she just vanished." Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Martha decided to visit Emily's hometown. She hoped that by talking to people who knew Emily, she might uncover something the police had missed. The town was small and close-knit, and it didn't take long for Martha to find Emily's old house, now occupied by an elderly woman named Mrs. Hargrove. Mrs. Hargrove welcomed Martha inside and, over tea, shared stories of Emily's life. "She was such a bright, spirited girl," Mrs. Hargrove said, her eyes misting with tears. "She had big dreams, wanted to travel the world. It's such a tragedy what happened to her." As they talked, Martha mentioned the ghostly encounter. Mrs. Hargrove didn't seem surprised. "I've heard others say they've seen her too, always looking for a ride, always disappearing. It's like her spirit can't rest." Martha decided to take one last drive down that fateful road, hoping to understand Emily's plight. She waited until nightfall, when the road was most eerie, and drove slowly, her eyes scanning the roadside for any sign of Emily. The storm clouds gathered, and soon, rain began to fall, just like the night she had first encountered Emily. Then, just as before, she saw her. Emily stood by the road, her figure illuminated by the headlights. Martha pulled over, and Emily climbed into the car, her presence both familiar and chilling. "Thank you for stopping," Emily said softly, her voice almost drowned by the rain. This time, Martha noticed the sadness in Emily's eyes, a sadness that seemed to hold years of sorrow and longing. "Emily," Martha began, her voice shaking. "What happened to you?" Emily looked at her, the pain in her eyes deepening. "I trusted the wrong person," she whispered. "He offered me a ride. I never saw my family again." Martha's heart ached. "Who did this to you?" Emily's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and anger. "His name was David. He was a charming stranger who turned out to be a monster." Martha nodded, determined to help Emily find peace. "Emily, I promise I'll make sure people know the truth. I'll find out what happened to David and make sure he pays for what he did to you." Emily's expression softened, a hint of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, but there's something more. To free me, you need to find my resting place. Only then can I be at peace." Martha agreed, vowing to uncover the truth. Over the next few weeks, she dug into old police reports, interviewed locals, and followed every lead. Her persistence paid off when she discovered an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, rumored to be David's hideout. With Officer Ramirez's help, they searched the cabin and its surroundings. In a shallow grave behind the cabin, they found Emily's remains. The discovery brought a mix of sorrow and relief to Martha. She arranged for a proper burial, ensuring Emily would be laid to rest with dignity. At the funeral, Martha stood by Emily's grave, feeling a sense of closure. As the last shovelful of earth was placed, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and Martha felt a comforting presence beside her. She turned to see Emily, her spirit now radiant and peaceful. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "I can finally rest." With that, Emily's spirit faded, leaving Martha with a profound sense of peace and accomplishment. She had not only solved a decades-old mystery, but had also helped a lost soul find rest. As Martha drove away from the cemetery, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that sometimes the past must be confronted to bring peace to the present. The road ahead was clear, and Martha was ready to continue her journey, forever changed by the girl she had met on a rainy night. Paul was an experienced hitchhiker, having traveled from coast to coast several times. One summer evening, he was picked up by a man in a pristine white sedan. The driver, who introduced himself as John, was overly friendly, his wide grin never faltering. Despite John's cheery demeanor, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that something was off as they drove through the barren desert. John began to tell Paul about his collection. He spoke in a calm, almost amused tone about how he loved picking up hitchhikers and hearing their stories. At first, Paul thought John was just eccentric, but as the conversation continued, he realized there was a sinister edge to John's words. John's grin widened as he described in vivid detail how some hitchhikers never made it to their destinations, how they became a part of his collection. Paul's blood ran cold as he glanced at the back seat and noticed something he hadn't before. A stack of old, weathered backpacks, each one different but all worn and dusty. Trying to stay calm, Paul asked John to pull over, claiming he needed to use the restroom. John agreed, still grinning, and pulled off to the side of the road. As soon as the car stopped, Paul bolted, running as fast as he could into the desert, not daring to look back. He could hear John's laughter echoing behind him, growing fainter as he ran. Paul eventually made it to a small town and reported the incident to the local authorities. They searched the area but found no trace of John or his white sedan. Paul never hitchhiked again, the memory of John's unsettling grin forever etched into his mind. Paul's escape from John and his horrifying collection left him deeply shaken, but he knew he couldn't rest until he had ensured that John would never harm anyone else. The haunting memory of John's unsettling grin and the ominous backpacks filled with the remnants of his victims drove Paul to action. He reported the incident to the authorities in the small town he had stumbled into. The local police were skeptical at first, but Paul's detailed description of the backpacks and John's eerie behavior persuaded them to take him seriously. Officer Daniels, a seasoned detective with a keen sense for the unusual, decided to take the lead on the case. "We need to find this guy and stop him," Daniels said, his expression grim. "But if he's as cunning as you say, we need a plan." Paul, still recovering from his ordeal, offered to help. "I know that road well. I can show you where he picked me up and where he might be heading." Over the next few days, Paul and Daniels pieced together a profile of John. They uncovered reports from other hitchhikers who had encountered a similar grinning man in a white sedan. but none had been able to provide as much detail as Paul. It seemed John had been preying on travelers for years, his charm and disarming smile hiding a sinister intent. They set up a trap on the same stretch of road where Paul had been picked up, hoping to catch John in the act. Paul, nervously volunteering as bait, waited by the roadside, trying to look as helpless as possible. Hidden nearby, Daniels and his team kept a close watch. Hours passed, and Paul's anxiety grew. Just as he was beginning to lose hope, the familiar white sedan pulled up. John's ever-present grin sent a shiver down Paul's spine. "Need a ride?" John asked, his voice as unsettlingly cheerful as ever. Paul swallowed his fear and nodded, getting into the car. As they drove, John started his usual routine of friendly chatter, but Paul kept his responses short, his heart racing. He discreetly signaled to Daniels, who followed at a safe distance. "Where are you headed this time?" John asked, his grin never faltering. "Just up ahead," Paul replied, his voice steady despite the terror he felt. "There's a rest stop where I can catch another ride." John's eyes flickered with a hint of suspicion, but he continued driving. As they approached the designated rest stop, Daniel's team sprang into action, blocking the road and surrounding the car. John's grin vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "Out of the car now," Daniels commanded, his gun drawn. John complied, his hands raised, but the sinister glint in his eyes remained. As he was handcuffed and led away, Paul couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and lingering dread. He knew the danger was over for now, but the memory of John's terrifying grin would haunt him forever. Back at the police station, John's car was thoroughly searched. They found more backpacks, each one telling a tragic story of its own. Personal belongings, journals, and photographs painted a grim picture of John's numerous victims. The evidence was overwhelming, and John was charged with multiple counts of kidnapping and murder as the trial approached. Paul struggled to regain a sense of normalcy. He attended support groups for survivors, sharing his story and finding solace in the company of those who had faced similar horrors. His bravery in coming forward and helping to capture John became a beacon of hope for many. The day of the trial, Paul took the stand, his voice unwavering as he recounted his ordeal. John's cold, blue eyes bore into him from across the courtroom, but Paul refused to be intimidated. He knew that his testimony was crucial in ensuring that John would never harm another soul. After a tense trial, the jury found John guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, Paul felt a wave of relief wash over him. Justice had been served, and the grinning man was finally behind bars. With John's conviction, Paul felt a newfound sense of freedom. He continued his travels, but with a greater sense of caution and awareness. The experience had changed him, but it had also made him stronger. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it, knowing that he had the strength to overcome whatever came his way. Paul's journey continued, but he carried with him the lessons he had learned and the determination to never let fear control his life again. The memory of John's grin faded with time, replaced by the knowledge that he had survived and helped bring a predator to justice. The open road awaited, and Paul was ready to embrace it with a renewed sense of hope and resilience.